While Look Outside has an immediate kind of magic for any player after it almost inevitably opens with you facing a horrible fate, and soon learning the lethal potential of activities you otherwise wouldn't think about, like walking downstairs, or saying hello to a woman who definitely isn't a massive evil fungus queen in disguise. We've all been there. A remarkably unexpected appeal of the game that becomes clear as you play it is how much Look Outside hinges around the concept of friendship. Indeed, though it's easy to miss at first, or for quite a while if your version of Sam ends up being a bit of a loner, as was the case for me on my first playthrough, as the game continues, and particularly in its endings, it becomes clear that some of the main themes of Look Outside are the significance and strengths of the bonds that can form between us, the importance of fostering these bonds even when they seem surely impossible, and, almost paradoxically, the absolute gut-wrenching, heart-stopping terror that forming and maintaining bonds with others can instill in you. Because, surprise, even in the Cthulhu apocalypse there's time for social awkwardness. And this time, it can actually be lethal, rather than just making you sit in the shower and think about every mistake you've made since you became a sentient being. I know people have talked online about how great all the companions you can recruit in the game are, and trust me, I'm the captain of that ship, Captain's hat and all. But I think one thing that can often be overlooked is how clever it is to make so many of Look Outside's best and most endearing allies so consistently creepy themselves without fail, and how great this is for the game's horror on several levels. Since he's most people's first party member in the game, I think Joel is a good first example. Unless you leg it through the apartment or get very lucky with who knocks on your door in day one, Joel is going to be the first possible recruitable ally you can get on your team. Mercifully, he's also a great ally to team up with, since he's able to become an absolute unit if you keep him in your party and let him eat plenty of foes to grow up to become big and strong and capable of shooting infinite teeth. He can heal himself, and he's a plucky kid who needs a friend, and is grateful for the odd little family you build up over the course of the game. That said, this doesn't mean everything involving Joel is cooking him soup and playing whimsical video games together, since Joel's recruitment process is one of the first signs in the game that, damn, things are gonna get dark sometimes, and that, if you aren't careful, you're going to be one of the worst monsters of this story. And given one of the creatures you can meet is the literal concept of drowning, that's really saying something. In order to recruit Joel, you basically have to deal with becoming a person-sized bag of crunchy Doritos for a hot minute, before Joel chills out and you can recruit him. This means you have to be a calm enough player that being mauled doesn't immediately put you in the violence zone, and you could potentially die in your first interaction with your first recruitable companion, in a massive lose-lose where you presumably also traumatize a child who is already dealing with his entire family becoming figures out of the world's most messed up dental floss commercial. If you don't manage to recruit Joel in time, you instead leave him doomed to also have his mutation worsen alongside said dental floss commercial family, which is all the more harrowing knowing you could have saved the poor kid by taking him in. That said, it's not like this chapter of Joel's story is magically cheery if you do have him alongside your squad when the Tooth House mutates further, since he instead, at best, has to see his younger brother become a living, fleshy tree, and understand that his family have undergone a truly cruel fate that was absolutely no fault of their own. Herein lies the true strength of Look Outside. There's no route here where this story doesn't have some form of horror, and indeed, the bond you form with Joel and the way it leaves you rooting for him paradoxically makes the game's horror more potent, as even if you're the most wholesome adopted dad a toothed child could ever want, this hope you can keep a child safe in a post-apocalypse wherein they've already been dealt a vicious hand makes your playthroughs more stressful and fraught. Lee is another example of how this concept is built up through the early game. It's easy to miss recruiting Lee for a fair few playthroughs, unless you check out recruitable characters for the game online, or happen to be immensely foolhardy and decide you want to see if you can duke it out with the first truly deadly looking boss you can face in the game. By rewarding you with a relatively strong early game ally for what looks as though it's a call that is almost sure to place you in certain doom, Look Outside is able to establish to the player that the outcomes of their choices simply can't be predicted beforehand, and cements we're now in a world wherein opening your curtains one night might one-shot kill you, but facing off against a Lovecraftian nightmare creature will get you a new bestie, albeit a lightly homicidal one. The unpredictability of this aspect of the game, I believe, is one of its greatest strengths, and the source of a wide range of its tensest moments too. Which is true even when it comes to any fights you bring Lee to, since her transformation back into beast form can cause her to go into a temporary berserker mode that will often see her do damage to your team until she chills out. Lee is a great look outside companion in terms of how she tees you up to realise one of the biggest consistent messages of the game, namely that it challenges your preconceived concepts of humanity by showing that everyone has a monstrous side to them, and shows that the dangers these sides can present don't stop it from being well worth still choosing to believe in the best in people in the long run. There's a good reason Look Outside has an achievement for finishing the game with only Sam, and that's because it's so much harder to finish the game by yourself, which encourages you to see past potential party members' perceived flaws to give them a chance even when they seem a bit challenging, to say the least. And one of the most heartwarming aspects of the game is that you are almost always rewarded for making the compassionate call. For example, Dan's introduction is so off-putting that I genuinely almost pretended I wasn't home to avoid the guy, even though I was pretty sure he was human. But not only is he a really useful party member, he's also someone who you see true hidden depths to, both in his own personal quest and in a few sneaky moments of dialogue between all the streaming chaos. Sophie, Zarya and Monty are arguably much the same, since the game definitely tries to set up a scenario wherein some people may choose to kick these characters out solely for the crime of being kind of jerks. And I can't blame anyone who did so after Zarya kicked our rat son. But holding fast and choosing to see the good in them is shown to pay off in all their respective stories, even though each provide their own dangers, like your friendship with Monty having the potential to create an actual game over if you encourage his fire-starting tendencies too much, and with being too eager to get rid of Sophie running the risk of you accidentally giving her to a monster disguised as her mother, which might be up there for one of the most genuinely harrowing and full nightmare-fueled territory moments you can access from the safety of your own in-game apartment. The same tricks and questions the game presents here with possible allies hold true for a whole lot of the other party members you can recruit along the course of your travels. Helen and Audrey are perhaps the most obvious examples of this in some senses, since both appear to be spooky in some ways that can put you off totally trusting them, especially as Helen isn't exactly the most talkative before wanting to move in with you, though they become two of the nicest and most wholesome members of your team once you've gotten them on side. That said, there's still some turmoil here, since I spent most of the game terrified I'd run out of spare change and thus lose my ability to speak to my beloved vending machine wife. And with Helen, you really have to lock in once she starts to trust you, since missing any day of doing her side quest after it begins means you become her personal nemesis, and she starts hunting you down for realsies this time, which means the plot of Friday the 13th is only one forgotten chore away, even when you're best buds. While Audrey doesn't decide to stalk the earth to vanquish you because you betrayed her gardening efforts like Helen, the game does present an equally harrowing way up given her recruitment quest takes some of the most effort in the game, but is hard to ignore in any playthrough when you consider that, if you don't recruit her, she's trapped cold, alone, and unable to communicate in a part of the apartment where she has only the Rat King for company. And frankly, I find the idea of a masked slasher hunting me down less harrowing than the idea I let someone nice down when they needed me. Interestingly, the aforementioned rats on floor 1 are a pretty unique example of how Look Outside messes with you via bonding you with some characters by themselves. As indeed are any of the characters you're more likely to perhaps murk on a first playthrough rather than becoming buddy-buddy with them. In my first playthrough, the years of me playing video games wherein rats are your first quests and used for early EXP means I cleaved a path through these poor critters like a knife through hot butter first time around without thinking very much about it for a good while. Then, I adopted my rat son through the non-skippable quest of either losing an arm or letting your newfound rodent child get the chop. And the first question marks started to appear there, which quickly became exclamation marks when you get the rusty crown from defeating the Rat King after they deem you worthy, and you discover not only that, A, you can talk to the rats now, but also that, B, the rats are chill as hell, and are more than willing to help you out with some gifts of cheese and a little dose of rat capitalism that contains some pretty useful stuff. So, C, you've been thoughtlessly slaying a bunch of actually pretty sentient and content creatures the whole time. While Look Outside doesn't explicitly make you feel too bad about this, it's pretty surreal to note the creatures you may have written off as one-note foes for you to grind your early levels on are actually characters with their own thoughts, lives, hopes, and desire to vend goods and services, and that your non-Rusty Crown fight with them may have been as much them trying to defend themselves as you trying to defend yourself. Also, I can't help but think that when my rat son got old enough in the playthrough where I took out every other rat, he may have felt a little weird about it. But hey, At least the kid also had a frankly huge extended family all the same. Speaking of said extended family, and a character that many people will have killed before they ever recruited them, given they only became a recruitable character after some of the newer updates in the game, Lyle is also an interesting figure to look at under the lens we've considered all these other characters with. Lyle is simultaneously the figure our boy Sam is safest and least safe around, as while Lyle has a strikingly good opinion of Sam and is willing to throw himself into danger for the sake of getting to hang out with Sam, he's also undeniably a creepy stalker who stole the spare key to Sam's house, and who will, if you fight him, decide to effectively steal Sam's soul with his camera abilities, because he can't bear to part with him. Even though some would argue that fate is possibly even worse for Sam himself. In this sense, there's no version of the dynamic you can have with Lyle that is totally without horror, as you either kill a creepy but potentially redeemable character who is constantly trying to do you favours and look out for the squad, or you let someone you can't totally and truly trust with all context in mind live in your goddamn house. And no amount of fanfiction will convince me that's a totally chill scenario. On the other side of things, and in one of the other most iconic late game additions to Look Outside, Felipe is perhaps one of the most nuanced figures in the entire game to delve into when it comes to the way Look Outside makes the concept of friendship simultaneously heartwarming and the subject of countless major and minor horror moments. A huge part of this is the range of plot twists it takes to get Felipe to become a legitimate addition to your team, since he initially pretends to be a little moth pal in order to lure you into a false sense of security, before then revealing his true maniacal mushroom form and fighting you, only for the power of friendship to give you the opportunity to revive Felipe and make him an actual part of your team. As such, it's perhaps not surprising to say that the dynamic between you and Felipe is complicated, to say the least. To say the most, it's downright soap opera-esque, as Felipe explicitly and repeatedly states that he intends to kill you pretty much every other moment he gets chance, right up until he realises that, were Sam to stop believing him a cutesy Mothman taken down the wrong path by brainwashing, he might become a fried mushroom steak very, very quickly. In this way, the horror is real from either perspective. Sure, Sam has to deal with the knowledge that he's invited a somewhat evil fungus who enjoys doing harm to others into his home, and may be rewarded for his efforts painstakingly helping Felipe heal up by one day being eaten alive or something by a character he believes to be his pal. The setup may actually be worse for Felipe himself, given he's effectively now in a forced hostage scenario, with every being he considered like him having been offed, and mentions in dialogue that he realises he has no idea how he'd fend for himself. So, joke's on him, he's now forcibly your best friend, because that's the fundamental basis of a healthy friendship for sure. While there's a lot of other Look Outside party members I'd love to wax lyrical about here, mainly because Ernest and Colonel Squeakums are my ride or dies, and in my humble opinion worth fighting a million rat knights to recruit, the final companion I want to talk about here is that of a party member that would work in few other games, that of our dear Civil War loving friend Roaches. I won't lie to you, when I went down the road of recruiting Roaches for the first time, which involves finding various cockroaches in their places around the apartment building, letting them come for a ride in your inventory, and then leaving food out in your apartment overnight for them to eat, I believed I was maybe in the process of kicking off a particularly fascinating boss fight later down the road, especially given how many other bugs you fight in the game. Then, all of a sudden, one morning a billion roaches in a trench coat told me I had earned their loyalty and they would fight to the death in my honour, and I realised Look Outside is the best game of all time. Roaches is, for all intents and purposes, the least human party member in an already pretty non-human looking squad altogether. As such, it's hard to lose sight of the fact that Roaches has a pretty different perspective on life and their moral compass compared to any other party member too, as is evidenced by the Roach Civil War being based around two both relatively concerning perceptions of how they should live and regard Sam, and based on some of the endearing but deeply bizarre lines of dialogue you can get from them throughout the game. It's still possible to end up in beef with the insects in your apartment even after gaining Roach's eternal love too, which means you're always having to be careful about how you handle the little critters lurking in every corner of your apartment. Though it's almost more harrowing to realise that they consider you something between a landlord and a god, and that you decide their fate much in the way the Visitor decides humanity's fate, since that's a whole lot of responsibility and a whole lot more mouths to feed in a game with ultimately limited resources. I largely wanted to go over team members in this video because they, of course, are the main allies you amass throughout the course of the game, and are doubly interesting because of how many different ways their stories can be decided. That said, your team are by no means the only interesting figures in this regard, in no small part because a lot of the most striking character designs and premises tend to go to a whole lot of Look Outside's NPCs. Indeed, many of the most inherently video game enemy-looking figures actually tend to be amicable characters, with the likes of Keely, Jean, the transformed schoolteacher David, plenty of the bar and basement NPCs, and Summer all being pretty swell examples of just this. Keely and Summer are perhaps of the two strongest examples in this regard, since they're also two of the least antagonistic entities you meet in the entirety of the game, despite both having forms that fully made me flinch just a little when seeing them for the first time while playing at night. I know in my previous video about Look Outside's transformations, I went into a little about how both figures' altered forms seem to be symbolic of the turmoil and trauma they've been through, so I won't rehash all ground too much once more, but I do think the endearing nature of both characters is underlined by how much they've clearly been physically and emotionally affected by the events they've been through, and their exposure to the Visitor, which is made all the more intense and unsettling by the fact it doesn't totally seem like either are fully aware of what's happened to them, or why Sam or other people might be reacting to them slightly differently, which is both deeply tragic and makes your potential efforts to reach out to them and be there for them hit just a little bit harder, and feel that little bit more important. One of the fun things about the way Look Outside is constructed, though, is that even the premise of friendship and its immense capacity to heal and bond people, or giant rat creatures, is that even this is able to become rife territory for horror. This is evidenced when you play the game for the first time, as it's really hard to tell which characters can become your actual allies, and which will absolutely devour your cranium, or transform you into some sort of terrifying meat carpet. This makes it easy to fully lock in and go detective mode in order to make sure you're picking up on every context clue. And in my case, making up several context clues, due to a ceaseless sense of paranoia. It also keeps a healthy sense of horror alive even in the most cheerfully and whimsically platonic scenarios, as a part of you is still doing the maths on whether the character you speak to is secretly weighing you up to be a midnight snack. Spine is perhaps the coolest example of this, since she is responsible for one of the most twisted death sequences in the entire game, but also truly believes that said fate is the best possible thing for Sam, and only does so because she cares for him so deeply, which has come about because she lives in the alternate otherworldly version of our apartment, allowing her to watch Sam's day-to-day, and watch us sleep. It's not a super healthy dynamic, in short, but it is interesting that Spine is ostensibly an ally for the most part. Just an ally who is somehow much scarier than the vast majority of our enemies, as we can't take her out altogether without feeling maybe a tiny bit bad, but otherwise have to live with being interdimensional roommates with a creature that's the unholy spawn of Slenderman and an overly clinging, unhealthily codependent romantic partner. Even without the fully deadly tilt to things, recruiting party members has its own other trials and tribulations. First and foremost, even learning what requirements specific characters have to be recruited doesn't necessarily make things easier, but rather means you have to do mental maths and be on your toes constantly in order to try and make the game happen as you want, and make sure that you don't inadvertently allow one of your new beloved besties to get murked because you took a long shower and allowed their murder to happen, as I accidentally did at least once with our poor janitor pal Peppino. Though this adds to the overall sense of horror in the game, as you have to manage your limited resources not just to survive, but also to run the gauntlet that ensures you don't betray any of the allies you've grown attached to, it in turn makes the moments you share with these characters feel all the more special. Like, that's not just my rat son. That's my rat son who was a feeble ant for half of the game until I raised him to be a fighting champion over the course of a week. I'm done with a few eggs, a great sword, and a whole lot of bad parenting. And that's not just a collection of sentient cockroaches in a trench coat. That's a collection of sentient cockroaches that I collected in my apartment, fed a ton of snacks until they decided to help me wage war on the post-apocalyptic creatures of the beyond, and then solved their civil war so they could do lightning attacks and stuff. And that's... okay, that's Spider. He did just show up like that, to be fair. The game's hard mode, named Curse Mode, adds another extra obstacle to this, since you also have to jump through extra hoops like providing additional consumable items to specific companions, or do things like pay money in order to unlock Audrey's key to finish her recruitment quest, for example. Though this makes the game a lot harder, it works even better to add that extra delicious dose of horror and tension to the game, and leaves you having to ask yourself questions like, am I willing to let this precious, kind, many-toothed child face a diabolical fate because it costs 6 toothpaste to recruit them? Of course, before we close out the video, it'd be borderline bananas to talk all about how Look Outside uses the bonds and friendships you can build with characters to cultivate its specific brand of horror, without talking about the way this is done with the entity that kicks everything off to begin with. Your climactic encounter with the Visitor is built up as a dramatic finale possibility from the very first moments of the game, with the havoc it's unleashed on every living being on Earth seeming to suggest some truly malicious deeper intent being its main motivation. Then you meet the Visitor, and for a creature whose full form will turn you into a million billion sentient traumatized blue salami, who also devastate the planet because you've simply seen too much, it's a pretty damn nice entity. The minute the Visitor discovers humanity is sentient, and it's thus not alone in the universe, as there are creatures who can operate semi-independently, even if it also knows the cheeky Unity ending secret about how the two are linked, humanity seems to gain a sort of immense bro for life. The Visitor is curious and seemingly at least a little delighted to talk to you in the endings where you do speak to them, doesn't immediately wipe you out if you freak out and hit them a little, and apologizes for any harm they did to the planet by appearing, offering to take themselves away and allow humanity in all their new manifold forms to continue on as best they can the second they learn the effects they've had on the planet and those within it. It's quite sweet, really, but it's also a masterful move story-wise as far as I'm concerned, since it makes things so much more complex and so much more realistic in some senses by taking this approach, as it means you can't write the whole thing off as being the result of some ancient evil, or the cruel whims of some much bigger being, and thus place the whole story into a classic narrative of hero versus villain. The Visitor didn't mean to hurt anyone, and that means the damage that we see all throughout Look Outside, and all the pain we go through in order to save the world or further doom it, happens for, effectively, no reason, or at best because of the whim of fate, which is a little closer to real life in this sense, and a little more disconcerting because simply finding some way to annihilate the Visitor isn't actually defeating some great evil and tying up the story with a neat little bow. Indeed, the true ending proves this, since the only ending you defeat the Visitor in does so by replacing our complex, morally nuanced reality with a simpler JRPG parody of things. In effect, the true horror of Look Outside is how well it blurs lines. As a horror game that is one of the funniest I've ever played, as a story where your closest allies can also be your most vicious enemies, and wherein the most human relationships and dear friendships you can make in the game tend to be with surreally designed characters who've talked about ending you in a range of ominous and frankly creative ways. But hey, I have some good friendships that aren't all that different when I think about it. As ever, if you've watched this all the way through, a massive thanks from me. Given Look Outside isn't a game any of my friends have played, it's been really cool seeing people's reactions to my videos and thoughts on the game. And if you've left any comments, or just watched the video and had real human thoughts in your head about your perspective, then I owe you another thanks, because it's been legitimately so neat to hear more people have a ton of cool thoughts about one of my favourite games and its fresh and funky lore. There's a ton more I could have talked about here, but this ended up a pretty chunky script as is. But if you have any other thoughts on this topic, I would be stoked to hear them, especially as I'm getting ever closer to 100%ing the game and more obsessed than ever. If you're hearing this right now, I hope you have a stellar morning, afternoon, or night, and that at least some of your allies are both loyal and a little Lovecraftian. And if none are, I am your ally now, and you cannot confirm or deny if I am made of 3,000 sentient roaches or not.